Okay. All right.
Okay, a little introduction about myself. I this is being recorded. I have been interested in livestock grazing on public lands ever since I was a college student. I originally was a major in wildlife biology and botany, and I quickly realized that the biggest impact on both plants and animals in the West was coming from livestock. And then I attended Montana State University, range science, but was basically asked to leave it because I was not enough of an advocate of ranching for the program's professors. And at that point, I decided to go to another program at the University of California called Science Communication to write about some of these environmental issues. And among the things that I wrote was this book called Welfare Ranching, the Subsidized Destruction of the American West. And I've also written books on energy, thrillcraft, coal mining in the mountains of the Appalachia, about a dozen books on national parks and wilderness. Um, anyway, a whole range of topics that are interrelated actually with the issue of livestock grazing as well. So is this thing I'm seeing, let's see if this, okay, I think this is working. Um, so grazing in the West, no right way to do the wrong thing. And I hope by the end of this presentation, you will agree with me that grazing livestock, particularly in the American West, although I will make the case that a lot of what I say about the American West is true for other parts of the country, including the Eastern United States. But I'm going to focus on the American West because I'm going to be focused primarily on public lands grazing. That isn't to say that impacts from cattle grazing don't happen to private lands or lands in the Eastern United States. Okay, one of the problems we have with grazing in the West is we have this whole Marlboro Man mythology that has put cowboys and ranching in sort of a positive light. So we've got Western movies, country Western singers, and they've all improved the image of the cowboy. But back in the 1800s, the cowboy was seen as a kind of a lowly guy who, barely had an education, worked for almost nothing. And it was almost an insult to say you were a cowboy, but that's changed now. And what has happened is that a lot of uh, propaganda is out there, I would call it, that promotes ranching as a lifestyle, and I call it a death style. And you'll see what I mean by death style here in a little bit if you give me time. One of the problems with grazing in the West is the public lands are extremely arid, and aridity imposes all kinds of limits on things. But the red here in this picture are grazing allotments where there's under 12 inches of precipitation a year. The blue are grazing allotments with more than 12 inches of precipitation a year. 12 inches is usually sort of the limit for what we would call desert lands. And then the green is places that aren't grazed, mostly in the Pacific Northwest because there's so much snow, and then a little bit down in the Southwest for various reasons. But most of the public lands in the West have grazing to some degree. And there's 306 million acres of grazed acres. And these are our lands, public lands. They belong to everybody, but they're actually operated as if they belong to the livestock industry. And how much is 306 million acres? Well, it's equal to the 14 eastern seaboard states plus Missouri. And two agencies, the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, manage the majority of public lands grazing in the West. But it's not just the BLM or Forest Service. There are many wildlife refuges, even though they're called refuges, where they're grazed by livestock. So this is Fish Springs National Wildlife Refuge in Utah, with plenty of cows out there. And even some national parks have grazing on it. This is Grand Cow National Park in Wyoming, uh, with its share of cattle on it. And even wilderness areas. So this really surprised a lot of people because wilderness areas are supposed to be managed for their natural components and processes, but there was an exception in the 1964 Wilderness Act that allowed grazing to occur on those lands. So we have even a lot of wilderness areas in the West that have livestock grazing on it. And just to give you an example of how pervasive this is a map showing the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The yellow parts that you see here are public lands that are grazed by livestock. And mind you, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem has some of the largest native ungulate herds like elk and bison and so forth in the West, but the vast majority of the area is still given over to domestic livestock. The red parts there are private lands and tribal lands that are grazed. So the ecological footprint affects more than 1 billion public and private acres. So I'm combining both the private lands with the public lands. And that includes 770 million acres of rangeland grazed by livestock, of which 43% is public lands, 120 million acres of pasture grazed by livestock, and more than 250 million acres of crops growing feed that's consumed by livestock, primarily by cattle. So when you put this all together, it's a huge footprint in the United States. And then globally, it's just as pervasive. Livestock production affects 70% of all agricultural land use and impacts 30% of the land surface of the planet. There's no single thing that humans do that affects more of the planet than livestock. And it's particularly pernicious in the tropics where a lot of tropical landscapes are being converted to grazing for livestock. And since these are some of the highest biodiversity areas, tropical rainforests, it has a disproportionate influence on biodiversity globally. In the Western United States, there are approximately 525 million acres, public and private, that's grazed by domestic landscape. That's 70% of the land. Just about every acre that can be grazed is grazed. So places like high elevation terrain, like in the Cascades where they got lots of snow, some national parks, etc., are excluded from that. But a whole lot of the West is grazed by livestock. And then you got cropland. Most of the cropland around the country is used to grow food for cattle and sheep and other domestic and pork and chicken too. But cattle consume the bulk of that. And you have all the time, I hear this in the West, maybe you hear it back there, I don't know, in the East, but some suggest that we save the rancher to preclude subdivisions, as if subdivisions are the major threat to Western landscapes. Yet in the entire United States, developed land, that includes factories, highways, subdivisions like you see here, covers only 3% of the landscape. Whereas, as I mentioned before, the livestock industry affects 70% of the landscape across the country outside of Alaska. So here's California, which is the most urbanized landscape in the West. And 49%, that dark purple, is federal land, much of it grazed by livestock. Then the light blue is private land, which again, most of it is grazed by livestock. And then you have the purple, the dark purple there, which is a ag land, which again, a lot of that is crops that are grown to feed livestock. And all the urbanization in California is the yellow slice that you see there. So if you're going to, if you could eliminate livestock from California, you know, you could take LA and San Francisco and all that, and it really would be having a relatively minor effect on the landscape. And even in states like Montana, here's an example. This is a gap analysis. Gap analysis is where they use aerial photographs to photograph the land use in an area. And this goes down to a 30-meter square. In other words, just a house will show up on this. And they find that, for example, hay cropland is 5.4% of the state acres, just hay. And this is the urbanization of Montana, 0.17%, despite Bozeman and Billings and all these towns. They're dots on the map. They're nothing. If all you had were those towns, Montana would be an incredibly wild place. And despite all this use and footprint, and I'll be getting to individual impacts in a second, it contributes almost nothing to the economy in the West. So grazing, if you look at this chart here, you can hardly see the sliver. It's on the left-hand side there below timber. 0.2% of the jobs on Department of Interior lands, that would be BLM lands, National Wildlife Refuge lands, and National Park lands, are attributed to livestock grazing. So it has a very limited economic perspective. Yet constantly I hear about how important it is to local economies. And that's said over and over again by people that just don't know their economics. If you ever are interested in that, by the way, Headwaters Economics in Bozeman has a wonderful chart where you can go and look up any county and see what the economic contributions of different economic activities are. And usually it's less than 1%, even in the most, cowboy counties in the whole West. So grazing of plants is only one of the impacts from livestock production. And I'll go into some of these things. So this is an important point. When we talk about this stuff, people will talk about livestock grazing. They don't realize there's a whole lot more going on besides grazing of grasses. For one thing, the majority of ecosystems of the West did not involve with large grazing animals. The whole Great Basin, a lot of the Utah Plateau, and the deserts in the Southwest did not have like herds of bison in the historic past. During the Pleistocene, there were all kinds of animals out here, but the climate was entirely different then. The plant communities were entirely different then. There's no ecological analog to the Pleistocene today that could support those kinds of animals. And then you often hear, well, the cattle are just replacing the bison. As I said, a lot of the West didn't have bison anyway. But even that statement is not correct because bison move more often. They spend less time in riparian areas, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But those are the areas around streams. They're able to defend themselves against predators, and they don't require feed in the winter to survive usually. And they have a whole lot of other traits that make them special. For example, if you look at that bison picture there, you can see the shoulder is the highest point. That allows bisons to run long distances effortlessly, sort of using their shoulders as a fulcrum for easy movement. Cattle are straight backed. They can't move nearly as efficiently over large areas. And that's an adaptation the bison had to moving around to get suitable food, etc., during cold periods where there was deep snow or moving for drought, etc. Now, overgrazing doesn't happen overnight. Rather, it's what happens as you graze a plant. The plant goes Mayday, Mayday, because it needs the green parts of the plant to feed itself. So when it loses it, when anything crops it translocates energy from its roots to grow new leaves. So if it doesn't have a sufficient amount of time to rest between grazing periods, the roots get shrunk. And then when the next drought comes along, a lot of those grasses die. And the other thing that happens is with heavy grazing, a lot of times the seed production is eliminated. So both of those things over time will gradually lead to a loss of native grasses. But livestock production is more than the grazing. It's irrigated hayfields, it's predator control, it's herbicide spraying, for example, to promote grasses. And the spraying of sagebrush has gone on for years in the West. They're still doing this in places, even though sagebrush is critical habitat for over 350 other species. I'll talk a little bit more about the loss of sagebrush further on. And then we have predator killing from Wildlife Services. In 2022, Wildlife Services killed 56,000 and some odd coyotes, 26,000 or so beavers, a bunch of foxes, bobcats, 450 bears, 219 gray wolves, 205 mountain lions, and 7 grizzly bears. And this is largely, not entirely, but a lot of it's done to protect livestock animals. And then you have the poisoning of what are called pests, like prairie dogs around the West. Prairie dogs towns are very important ecosystems for all kinds of wildlife. Well over 100 species of other animals depend on prairie dogs for their home and habitat. All right, now I'm going to step back for a second and talk about croplands. The two biggest crops grown on croplands in the United States are soy and corn. And this shows you kind of the area of compared to other crops. Almost all this soy and corn is being used to feed livestock. For example, sweet corn, which you may be familiar with, is a couple 100,000 acres is all the sweet corn in the whole country. Whereas there's 90 million acres of feeder corn. So, I mean, if all you were doing is growing sweet corn for people to eat corn on the cob, you'd hardly have any corn grown. And the same with soy. About 1% or so of soy is used for things like tofu and things like that. So 90 million acres of corn, mostly in the upper Midwest, but lots of places in the West too grow corn, some of it irrigated. How big is that? State of Montana is 93 million acres. So imagine everything in Montana from one corner to the other, north, south, east, west, nothing but corn. That's how much corn we're growing, mostly to feed livestock. And ag is terrible. I mean, agriculture is one of the worst things that humans do to the landscape. We have to have some, but we ought to be trying to minimize our agricultural production, not expand it. And ag fragments wildlife habitat. It causes soil erosion. It pollutes rivers. It's spreading pesticides all over. It's not a good thing, even under the best circumstances. So a lot of this ag production is for livestock. Now, because the West is so arid, it limits what you can afford to do to mitigate impacts and magnifies the ecological costs of livestock production. This is in Mojave National Preserve, by the way, one of our national park units that's grazed. But what I mean by that is if you're going to try to, let's say, I'm going to talk a little bit about how cows affect streams. If you want to try to keep the cows out of the streams, you got to spend a lot of money fencing the streams. Well, on a place like in the West, like a place like this, you might need 250 acres of land to support one cow year round. Well, at that kind of density, you can't afford to spend a lot of money like fencing riparian areas. You can't afford to spend a lot of money doing a whole lot of other things that might mitigate the impacts of the cows. And because it's so arid, the impacts are greater. So we're using the wrong animal in the wrong place. Cattle breeds in the US originate in moist woodlands in Eurasia. And yet in the West, they migrate to the things that's most like moist woodlands, which tends to be these areas around water, which we call riparian areas. And so they gravitate to these waters. By the way, this is in a national riparian conservation area where the BLM is supposedly preserving the riparian area by grazing it with cattle. Anyway, note the wide, shallow streams. The banks have been broken down and crushed and so forth. And this is what happens with cattle. It winds up making the stream wider. The water is warmer. You don't see any willows or vegetation growing, tall vegetation along here that would support, say, songbirds and so forth. And yet we're used to these landscapes. Most people will drive by this and say, what a pretty looking creek. Same with down cutting, what's called arroyo cutting in the Southwest, where because that vegetation is eliminated, whenever there's a flash flood or a lot of water, you get a lot more erosion. And then what happens is the water table drops and you can no longer support the riparian vegetation on the higher banks. This is in the Sheldon Wildlife Refuge in Nevada, which is the largest area today without cattle grazing, by the way, partly because of this man here who was the refuge manager, Barry Ricewick, who reminded me of Matt Dillon when he would come up to grazers and stuff. He was pretty fearless. But anyway, this on the left here, where you can see him in the bottom of the picture, was a wet meadow perhaps 50 years ago, and then down cutting kept it happening. So now there's no water to support it. Yet we tripped on this aspen cut log on the upper parts in the sagebrush. So this was once had beaver and was aspen grove, but cattle grazing destroyed all that. And this is a thing I call landscape amnesia. We're so used to the way things look today that we have no idea what it really looked like in the past. So, for example, the stream on the left here is grazed. Most people would look at that and say, what a beautiful trout stream. Well, I took this picture looking at that, and then I turned right where I'm standing, where the first picture on the left is taken. I turned around, and you can see where the stream goes into a fence. And that area beyond the fence hadn't been grazed in about 100 years. And you can see the stream suddenly gets much narrower and deeper. And then, oops, see. And then I walked inside the fence, and you can see the picture on the left. You can barely see the creek going through there. to the left lower end of the picture. And then I was walking across to try to get a picture looking back at the fence, which you can see in the background about the top maybe fifth of the picture. There's the fence line. And I actually, where the arrow is pointing, fell into the creek there. I couldn't see it. And I was up to my thighs in water. That's what it used to look like. But we don't know it because we're so used to the changes. Here's another example. People are always talking about how bad subdivisions are. And I'm one of those people that thinks I'll take the subdivisions any day over the cows, with a few general exceptions depending upon where the subdivision is. But this is a subdivision on the left here where the trees are, and there's a creek that comes across the road there and goes to the right where you can see the water. Okay, so this is what the subdivision area looks like with willows and everything. And this is the other side of the road. This is what the cows have done to the same exact stream. It's not because of climate or anything else. It's one factor, cows. And if you were talking about what's better wildlife habitat, what's better for water quality, etc., the place on the left is by far better. Here's another example, Aravipa Creek in Arizona. I'm looking upstream in the left-hand picture, and you can see there's hardly anything growing along the stream. There's some cottonwood trees, tall, what I call historic cottonwood trees, because they were created 100 and some years ago, and they're still surviving. But I turned around right at that fence that you see in the picture and took a picture looking downstream. 5 years with no grazing. What a difference. If you're looking for songbird habitat, whatever. Here's another picture. The picture on the left is the San Pedro River, which is now the San Pedro conservation area, which the BLM is proposing to graze again, by the way. But this is what it looked like with cows. And this picture on the left with the cows was taken from a ridge. And 11 years later, I went back to the same spot and took the picture on the right. That's what it looks like today without the cows in 11 years. Now, it doesn't take much of a scientist to say which is better for wildlife. Here's some arroyo cutting on Tin Cup Creek in Caribou National Forest in Idaho. Same thing, vegetation loss, and then you get more soil erosion and down cutting. So livestock production is the single biggest factor responsible for listing of endangered species in the West. So give you an example, loss of riparian habitat and effects like nesting songbirds and all kinds of other animals, beaver, etc. This is a partial list of endangered species in Arizona. This is just species that have declined due to livestock production. It includes 18 fish, 9 amphibians, 5 reptiles, 22 birds, and more than a dozen mammals. And it doesn't include the candidates for listing. There's nothing else that has affected more wildlife and is responsible for more endangered species listing in the West than livestock production. Another problem is ag is generally exempt from the Clean Water Act, and cows are a major source of water pollution in the West. An average cow excretes as much waste as 50 people. That's a day. So Montana has 2.5 million cows. This is like having the untreated sewage of more than 100 million people spread across the landscape. We don't even think about it, but this is what's going on throughout the West. Water use. Most people assume that domestic water use, such as drinking water, swimming pools, and all that, uses the bulk of Western waters. I see articles all the time spreading this myth. It just shows what they haven't done their homework. It doesn't take much to find this out, that the biggest impact on water removal is for hay and pasture production. 90% of the water in the West, as a generalization across the West, goes to irrigation to grow cow forage. And another consequence of that is we build all these dams around the West. There are hundreds and hundreds, thousands of dams around the West, most of them built to store water for irrigation. Now, they may have other uses, like they might produce hydroelectric power. In fact, the hydroelectric power people, the people using that electricity, are often paying more for that electricity to subsidize the water for the ranchers. So you can be a poor person living in Reno on welfare, and you're going to pay more for your water than a rancher will to irrigate the fields for alfalfa. And those dams change the flow of the river so that you have a change in the water temperatures and other parts of the aquatic regime. So many native fish, 45% of the fish in the West, by the way, are on the endangered species list, partly due to the changes in stream flows due to dams and water removal for irrigation. And dams block spawning salmon. There's a big controversy right now about taking down dams on the Snake River to get more fish, salmon upstream for opening up those spawning habitat to try to save the salmon from being going to extinction. But a lot of that dam is for irrigation to grow cattle feed. And even where they don't have dams, big dams, they have small dams. So this is a water diversion on the Big Hole River in Montana uh, to divert water into irrigation. And that's one of the reasons why the Montana grayling is poised to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. Lack of water in the summertime. Dewatering affects amphibians. You have the Oregon spotted frog here in Oregon, where I am, that's endangered partly due to irrigation changes in stream flows. Also, a lot of people don't care about snails or whatever, but they're an important part of the whole ecosystem too. And this is a picture of the Bruno hot springs in the 1920s. This is southern Idaho. I work for the BLM here, by the way, as a botanist. And this is the Bruno hot springs in 1990s. And the Bruno hot spring snail is dependent on that hot water, and it's been reduced because of groundwater pumping for irrigation. They have a lot of parts of the West, they don't have to just divert the streams, they take the water out of the ground. Irrigation destroys fishing and greater competition for fish, changes in flows, and so forth. And that means all sorts of other animals are affected. So you have river otters, eagles, osprey, mink, kingfisher are all harmed because you have a reduction in overall of fish because there's less habitat for them in the summertime. And then wetlands have been destroyed and converted into fields. In the Klamath Basin, in Oregon, Washington border, 60% of the wetlands, which used to be some of the biggest wetlands in the whole West, have been converted to fields for creating hay and alfalfa. So here's the Gallatin Valley in Montana where Bozeman is. And you hear all the time about how subdivisions are destroying the valley. But what is it destroying? It's destroying wheat fields and hay fields. And particularly both of them are single crops. They're a monocrop. A wheat field is a biological desert. I used to teach field ecology classes, and we'd be driving across stuff like this, and the students all thought it was great. Look at all this farmland. Well, I was by the end of the course, I got them to think about that was probably the worst thing we could do to the landscape, because you eliminate the native vegetation and you put a single crop like wheat or alfalfa in there and replace the diversity entirely for native species, for native plants, etc. And a lot of this is totally unnecessary. Here's an irrigated alfalfa field in Nevada. And then another thing that happens is that, to make it even worse, they tend to grow things like alfalfa, which transpires a lot of water per its growth cycle. In other words, it's not adapted to living in the desert. It's adapted to living in very moist conditions. So it takes a lot of water to grow just a little bit of alfalfa. Here's an example of flood irrigated field. I took this picture in Nevada. The place on the left, where the white thing is, right to the right of it is the boundary of a wildlife refuge, the Stillwater National Wildlife Refuge in Nevada. And they flood irrigate the whole place to grow alfalfa, and the wildlife refuge has no water. To me, that's legalized vandalism. Okay, so just some charts to show you. Here's Colorado water use. 85% of the water in Colorado is for irrigation. Public water supply, 4%. Here's Nevada, the driest state in the nation, by the way. 90% of the water goes for irrigation. Public water supply, 5%. And the thing is, people go to Las Vegas, they see all the sprinklers and pools and so forth, and they think, oh gosh, look at all that water wasted. Again, if all you had was Las Vegas and Reno and all the casinos and stuff, there would be plenty of water left in Nevada. Same with California. 83% of the water in California goes for irrigation. And what do they grow with that? Well, irrigated pasture and alfalfa are the two biggest crops. So again, if you wanted to, when people talk about putting a brick in their toilet in some place like Santa Barbara to save water, it's just totally crazy, because that isn't the problem. The problem is irrigated agriculture and growing crops for livestock. I can see using irrigation for growing lettuce or, other things like that. That makes a very small percentage of the landscape. So the grazing impacts are so pervasive, we hardly know what the West looks like. But one of the places you can see this is all these right-of-ways along highways. A lot of them are still covered with native vegetation. And this is in Wyoming, a picture I took. And so you see the grass on either side of the highway and then nothing where it's grazed off on the other side of the fence. But we have this what's called a sliding baseline, this landscape amnesia. We think denuded landscapes are the norm. This is Escalante Grand Staircase National Monument in Utah, uh, obviously impacted by cattle. And this is the Nature Conservancy's Dugout Ranch in Utah. Nature Conservancy is an organization I particularly dislike for a variety of reasons, because they advocate both logging and grazing as if they're good things for the land. But anyway, I've been to a lot of their places in the West, and a lot of them are severely overgrazed. But what happens when that happens? When you graze that way, you eliminate the vegetation that would support bees and butterflies. Southern Utah alone has 450 native bees. Most of them live in the soil. And as the soil gets compacted and it erodes and so forth, you're destroying that native bee habitat. Biocrusts is another thing. That's lichens, mossins, etc., that hold the soil, and they reduce erosion and they increase water infiltration, and they also fix nitrogen and make it available for other plants. And these crusts are destroyed by the hooves of cows and sheep. And one of the other impacts, and they're kind of related, as you destroy the crusts exist a lot of times between the native bunch grasses, and they keep other plants like cheatgrass from getting established. And cheatgrass is a plant that burns readily, and it's destroying a lot of the sagebrush in the whole West. Sagebrush fire rotation is 50 to 400 years. And now we have fire rotations in some of these areas of, every couple of years we get fire with the cheatgrass. And this is a good example. I show this picture to people, and they look at the grass in the foreground and say, oh, look at all that grass. That's all cheatgrass. And you can see how the sagebrush is being wedged in by cheatgrass on both sides of this picture. And that cheatgrass is gradually causing all the sagebrush to burn up. And as the sagebrush burns up, so do things like sage grouse and pygmy rabbits and a whole lot of other species are going extinct as a result. And that sagebrush habitat is critical for numerous wildlife, from mule deer and pronghorn antelope, that maybe not entirely depend on it, but still you have less sagebrush, you have less of those species too. Then we have the destruction of predators. Wolves, grizzlies, cougars are killed on public lands. Shouldn't the cows be removed, not the predators? I mean, what is going on here where we put the emphasis on, oh, if a wolf kills a cow, we're going to go kill the wolf? I say, well, how about we just get rid of the cow and then we don't have the problem? And the livestock industry demands predator slaughter, and the Wildlife Services, which is a U.S. government agency, a branch of the Department of Agriculture, using your tax dollars, goes out and traps and shoots and poisons native predators. Here's heads of mountain lions that were killed in Arizona by Wildlife Services. 95% of the wolf mortality in the West is from humans. And most of that, not all of it, but a lot of it is due to demands of the livestock industry. And then you have disease transmission. Domestic sheep transmits disease to wild sheep. This ram is blind from pink eye, a disease from domestic sheep. They also get pneumonia and other things. So across the West, these bighorn sheep herds are winking in and out because they get disease and then they die off. And very few sheep, usually you got to have about a couple of hundred bighorn sheep to have a viable herd. And the majority of herds in the West are 50 animals or less. Then we have the allotment of forage. This is a pie. I just made it to make the graphic. It's pumpkin pie. Anyway, the cows actually get more of the pumpkin pie than I'm showing here. It's about 90% in most of the West is allotted to livestock on public lands. And that has a negative impact. If you don't have food for wildlife, because it's all going in the cows, you're again having a big impact on the public's wildlife and its carrying capacity. So, and it's just even the mere presence of livestock affects wildlife. So elk, pronghorn, deer, and other species have been shown to socially avoid areas actively grazed. Now, they might go into an area that have been grazed by livestock and the livestock are gone, but they will not, unless they're starving to death, associate with domestic livestock. So that means that they're being pushed out of good habitat into lesser habitat where they might be more vulnerable to predators or whatever. And then you have all the stuff that goes with livestock, like fences, barbed wires all across the West. Well, this blocks migrations, animals get caught in it and die. It's just a terrible thing. Then we have things like uh, in Yellowstone right now, you have bison being shot to appease the livestock industry and tribal people. Nearly 40% of the northern herd was eliminated in 2023. Most of that shot by tribal members, and this has huge impacts on the whole ecosystem. One, the bison that are getting shot are the ones most likely to migrate. So you're eliminating that migration tendency from the population. You're also eliminating food that would support other wildlife like coyotes or wolves or bears or whatever, and removing that from the ecosystem and the influence of bison on the ecosystem, on the grasslands. And there's the genetic thing. As the population gets shrunk, 40% loss in 1 year is a significant amount of the population. And so since bison already went through what's called a genetic bottleneck when they were first totally saved off from being extinct, anytime we push them back again like that, we're reducing their genetic diversity. And so this is all being done to keep bison from being wild. And you read, there's another thing I read all the time, irritates me. They say, oh, well, we're saving bison because they're on somebody's ranch or they're on some reservation. None of those animals are wild bison. They're domesticated animals. They're treated just like cattle. They're fenced in. They're inoculated. They breed certain animals over others. It's just eliminating the wild bison from the landscape. And then we have things like wildlife funds paid for the mitigation of grazing impacts. This is on the Gila River in Arizona. There's hoses, as you can see, they planted cottonwood trees because the cottonwood had been all eliminated by cattle grazing. And when I called them up, the BLM, I said, well, who's paying for these pipelines and the planting of trees? Well, it came out of the wildlife fund. It didn't come from the range fund. So the ranchers don't pay for that. And then you have what are called range improvements, like water tanks and pipelines and stuff like that. Some of them cost millions of dollars. And for example, there's a proposal right now to open up some lands near Yellowstone Park and Paradise Valley to grazing. And one of those allotments, they're going to build a pipeline and other things to facilitate the grazing. And on that allotment, the government gets a couple of $1,000s a year from the grazers for it because they don't, they charge very little. And yet they're going to spend like $500,000 on range developments to enable the grazing to go on there. And then you have cattle guard. Every one of these things costs between $25,000 and $50,000 to put in. Taxpayers pay for that. We have a bigger picture now. What happens to global warming? What do you think is worse, that vehicles like that or the cows? And I guess from my show, you get an idea of what I'm talking about here, which one I'd say is the right one. And that is the livestock sector is a major player in climate change, responsible by some accounting, 18% of greenhouse gases. Now, the World Watch Institute does a broader interpretation of livestock impacts and says up to 50% of all the global greenhouse emissions can be attributed to livestock production. And just to give you an idea of what they include that isn't included in the other one. For example, when tropical rainforests are chopped down for livestock pasture, they're counting that as a greenhouse gas emission cost of livestock, which isn't in the UN proposal, things like that. So the effects of meat eating on CO2, a University of Chicago study calculated if Americans were to reduce meat consumption by 20%, this is not a lot, it would be as if we all switched from standard sedan to an ultra efficient Prius. So this gets to the point that, if you could reduce your livestock consumption, your meat consumption, you'd make a big difference in climate. And you hear a lot of people saying, well, we're going to have grass-fed beef and that's better. Well, it's not better. I did a whole book on climate and energy and industrial farming too. And one of the things it's interesting is that grass-fed beef has more emissions than CAFOs, which is confined animal farm operations like stockyards. And the reason is because uh, for better or for worse, animals in the CAFOs are fed, things like corn and soy, as I mentioned earlier, which is a high protein food compared to grasses. So it takes a lot longer for a cow to put on a pound of meat grazing on just grasses. And they also have to be live a lot longer to get to the same weight that they would normally be slaughtered at. So um, even if you wanted to go to grass-fed beef, there isn't anywhere near enough land to do that to meet the current consumption of meat. So and there's increases. And I'm not advocating for CAFOs, by the way. My conclusion is we should be eating less meat of any kind. So another interesting thing is this whole thing of local versus meat and dairy. A study by Carnegie Mellon concluded that production counts more than food miles for carbon output, meaning exempting meat and dairy from one's diet just one day a week did more to lower one's carbon footprint than eating local every day of the week, because transportation actually is a small part of the uh, energy cost involved in food, about 1% usually. So the message is eat less meat, eat more fruits and vegetables. And these, growing fruits and vegetables have their impacts too, but it takes a lot less land to produce the food and vegetables that would be needed to feed the country. Even things like wheat, which is the largest single crop that humans consume directly, it's still a small percentage of the landscape compared to what we use for growing cows. So, time to end the abuse, at least on public lands. And there's a thing, legislation that's been introduced in the Congress several times now, voluntary grazing permit buyout. And under this proposal, ranchers would be paid by private foundations at this point money to take their cows off of the public allotments that they're grazing, and the government agency responsible, whether it's the Forest Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, whoever, BLM, would agree not to allow that area to be grazed again. It would be permanently retired from grazing allotments. And this has been successful on a smaller scale, but been done around the West in various places. I mentioned the Sheldon Wildlife Refuge, which is the largest area without cattle in the Great Basin. That was all a voluntary permit buyout. The recently, Great Basin National Park had a number of allotments closed from permit buyout. So this has also been used in the Boulder White Clouds of Idaho, where it was a wilderness legislation, but they included buyout wording that any grazing allotment that touched a wilderness area could be bought out, not just in the wilderness, but surrounding areas. So 1 million acres around the Boulder White Cloud are eligible for permit buyout. And I believe about 600,000 acres have been retired at this point. So this is a way, it's basically bribing ranchers to give up their grazing allotments, but a lot of them see an advantage to it because they can take this money and buy other private land if they want to stay in the business. A lot of ranchers are reaching retirement age, and you get $1 million for land you don't even own. It's a pretty good deal, and so a lot of them accept the buyout. Anyway, that's the end of my talk, and I'll answer any questions. Thank you.
All right. Okay.